And welcome back, folks. The time now is 2:18 on January 26th. My room temp has now risen to 73.6 degrees. If you've just joined us, this has been a Can My Sourdough Starter from January 14th, starting to revive date after it was in the refrigerator for 3 months practically. It took us about 7 days to get a solid rise where it was tripling in mass. And on day 8 and 9, performed beautifully, tripling in mass, rather in volume, at the 4-hour mark. So, our dough that was prepped this morning, after we've mixed it around 8 o'clock, we're looking at now being 2 o'clock. So that's about a 6-hour bulk fermentation at room temp. And we're about to start shaping. And wanted to use a loaf pan to help us out here. So that way, if you're new to shaping and or sourdough bread baking, it's okay to use a bread pan. In fact, I recommend it because it allows us to really hone in on the different skill sets, not only how we're managing our sourdough starter versus using it poorly, such as I just pulled it out of the refrigerator and started to use it, and why is my dough not working out? Well, that's because the sourdough starter wasn't active enough, etc. I'll go ahead and put the description down below on the beginning of the sourdough starter experiments so that you can reference that. For now, we're going to do the bread pan, scale out some dough, and bake it. See what a 3-month-old sourdough starter can do in regards to his performance and results. Again, that principle of bread baking being patience, because it takes time for a sourdough starter that's been inactive in the refrigerator for a while to really build strength and be able to use it to bake a bunch of bread. Here we have a batch of practically 31 pounds. That's 14.4 kilos that I'm going to fill up my bread rack here. It's a smaller bake than I'm normally used to. However, it's great for today because that allows us some time to talk about the dough. So it's doubled definitely in size and has a wonderful aroma. And you want to use all of your senses when we're baking here. I'm just kind of fanning it to enjoy that aroma. It's got a nice, I would say, nutty, sweet, complex aroma, which is what you want, because if I let it go and have it triple in size, now I'm running against the time clock, because I'm going to have to get through all of this dough shaped and baked before it loses that wonderful ideal window of when dough starts to rise, just like in your sourdough starter jar. It will eventually peak and start dropping. So if I start shaping and baking when it's peaked, I'm going to knock out air out of that dough, and it's going to have trouble trying to rise and fill itself back up because all of the food is gone. So now it's reducing in its volume. And if that happens in your dough, then you get what's called overproof dough, where it starts to collapse on itself, and the texture is more dense, not so chewy and bouncy. So again, proper sourdough starter management, proper dough management to your logistical situation, right? Because not everyone is baking that much at that time. So if you were only baking a couple of loaves, definitely you can push your sourdough starter a little bit further and your dough, allow it to ripen a little further if you're looking for that more sour flavor. Again, I'm looking for a more neutral flavor. meaning in acidity, so that you can actually taste the nuances of that wonderful flour blend of the freshly milled flour and the extra specialty flours that I special ordered. All right, let's begin. Now, before I start shaping these, I'm also going to touch base on how I prep these pans so that you don't get your dough sticking to them. And as this dough is now ready to prep all the breads, I'm going to pre-shape them first, do the pizzas and the baguettes in there. Then at the very end, that dough will be all kind of not mangled, but pulled in all sorts of different directions, which will give us the technically worst case scenario on getting a nicely shaped ball of dough, versus if you only shaped it in, say, a large bowl, and now you plop over your bowl on the counter because you're only making like 1 or 2 breads. It's a whole lot easier to like divide it in two, then neatly form it. But when you're dealing with quantity, that last couple of pieces of dough are definitely not ideal to work with, which is going to be a perfect example of how best to approach that shape for you to learn the most. Okay, I'm going to finish up with my batch, and then we'll get to the bread pans. Okay, so now we are set to grease our pans. I've got this handy dandy sprayer that I use for olive oil, and I'm just going to go ahead and smear that on. Now, I typically use a dusting flour over this oil, really to guarantee that ease of release. And I normally use rice flour that I freshly mill from brown rice in my mill. However, I'm out of that at the moment, so I'm going to be using my normal flour, which is my semolina that I dust my normal trays with. So I'm going to pause while I oil up my other pan here and be back. All right, these are all oiled up, and make sure that you also do that top rim and the lip, because as dough expands, it really does start to cling onto any and every surface. And if you have a dough that will bubble over that edge, it'll definitely adhere to this edge, so make sure it's also oiled. All right, I'm gonna get rid of this glove here. And I'm using this nice little duster that's typically used for powdered sugar. However, it does a great job at flour dusting as well. Just don't fill it up too much. You want it to rattle. And if it's too full, then the flour can't dance around inside that little chamber and it doesn't fall out properly. So, again, we're just trying to dust this as well as we can, coating it thoroughly, all the corners, all the edges. And typically you don't have to do this on a nice brand new pan that has a great non-stick feature to it. However, I've had bread get stuck and it's a pain to get out. I've heard that you can freeze it and that helps release it from the pan. I've never tried it. I've only taken a offset spatula and pried it. I have a video of that too. If you've got a really good way to get dough released from a stuck pan, let us know in the comments. And as you can see, we have really good coverage throughout that whole pan, and that's ready to go. Okay, so this pan will actually hold about 3 pounds of dough. I like to make my loaf pans large, and that way it lasts a little bit longer with a family of 5. However, your loaf pan will maybe be a little smaller, or heck, maybe even a little larger. So I'm going to first start with scaling out the amount of dough that I'm going to need for this batch. And that way you'll see what I do and why I do it. Now, as you can see, I have a pair of scissors that makes it much easier for me to scale out my dough and really fine tune the amount that I need. without pulling excessively on the big batch and damaging the air, knocking, in essence, all the air out every time you tug on the dough, especially if it's starting to get overproofed. So what you're going to do is just roll your dough like a burrito here. All right. Now, typically, that's basically my freestanding loaf there. And we're going to tuck in the ends there. Make it nice and uniform in shape because it's got to go in here. Now, before I do the other loaf, or rather, before I put this loaf in the pan, I'm just going to have it hang out off to the side here while I shape the other side of my loaf, because I like to, instead of doing one giant loaf, I'm going to make two sizable loaves. Each one here is 900 grams, almost a kilogram worth of dough. And that's roughly 2 pounds, right? So I guess this pan is more like 4 pounds. And it's easier for me to work with two 900 gram loaves versus one 1800 gram loaf. So, and then that way when they're done, I typically cut them in half, freeze one side, use the other, and then when the family runs out, I grab my other one out of the freezer. We're back in business. This way, I'm always using, when I cut the loaf in half, right? I'm always using that cut end for sandwiches, which are nice and uniform, versus starting off at the end. All right, so here we go. We got our 2 loaves. I'm going to make sure that my hands are relatively dry for this part, because you don't want to wet the loaf pan and introduce moisture to it. And since I've been using a spray bottle, as you saw, and water to dip my fingers and keep the dough from sticking to my hands or my table, the dough itself is rather moist. So I'm just going to dust it with a little bit of flour and dust the table around the loaf. Alternately, you could just pick up the loaf and set it down on a floured surface. However, this way, I could just tuck in the flour, loosening it up. See that? Loosening it up. That way I know there isn't any excess moisture down below. And you can feel it if it's catching onto the table or not. And if it is, like this one was, just give it a little bit more of a dusting. Be liberal here because, again, you don't want your loaf sticking. That would be a sad day. Okay, so now I'm just going to put them in. 1 loaf and 2 loaves. Give them a little jiggle. That way they find their new home. And now they're happy. So that's going to rest for maybe about 20 minutes, maybe 15, depending on how they're progressing visually. But right now, even if I threw it in the oven, it'd be good to go because it's in a loaf pan. And it'll give you beautiful bread as is. Now, I will score them because as they expand, you want them to expand evenly, or else you may get a blowout and it balloons, mushroom shape out the side, or blows over out the side, and you don't want that. You want them to grow uniformly upright. All right, more to come. Okay, the time has come. We've got an empty bin. We've got our 2 loaves ready to go into the oven. So let's give them a quick slash. with our baker's lamb. 1, 2, flip, 1, 2, and by flip I mean flip the blade. And as you can see, they have a nice curvature to give you a nice lip on that loaf. These, because I'm not really going very deep in the slashing, it's more just to ensure that they go straight up, checking to make sure I got all the way through. These will more likely just spread open versus give me a lip, and that's the nature of this bread pan and this process I have here, because ultimately the kids are going to be eating this and I want them to be able to chew it without a problem versus having like a really hard crusty crust. So there we go. Let's put them in the oven. It's been preheated at 450 degrees. I'm going to give them a light mist. And in they go. And here we are, hot out of the oven. They baked for about 35 minutes. I give these a little bit of extra time, sometimes even 40, just to make sure that they're cooked, because it's such a large dough ball, in essence, that I want to make sure that the in the middle is quite cooked. So now we're just going to shake them up a bit. And I'm going to grab a rack to put them on, like so. Tap, tap, and they should pop off. Oh, look at that. Beautiful. And you want to check to make sure you've got good crust color, because that is going to be an indicator that is fully cooked, or baked in this case. So we're going to pop this one out, tap, tap, tap. And look at that, gorgeous. So just take that extra moment and prep those pans well, so that way we don't have an issue with them sticking. I'm going to set these down here on my stove so that they're out of the way. We don't want any sort of mishaps because they are very hot still. And that way we have safety first, right? Which is why I also have these gloves that my wife bought me. They're barbecue gloves and they work really well. I like how the cuff is high up on the forearm to protect when you lift your hands up, and they can get hit by the oven door there or the edge of the oven and give you a little hello burn. All right, so these are good to go. We're going to let them cool completely before I slice them. And as you can see, mission accomplished. We have now proved the fact that our sourdough starter that was started back in January 14th, pulled out of the refrigerator, revived, took about 7 to 8 days for that to show us good rising. That is something I look for, the tripling in volume. The time now is 5:12 p.m., still January 26th. Now my kitchen's at 73.8 in temp. So hopefully that gives you a really good idea of sourdough management, dough management, and your shaping and baking session and how I should progress. We can now rest easy, knowing that if we have to use our sourdough starter from the fridge, make sure that we have a good, strong starter that's active, ready to go, and that way we'll have the confidence to bake our breads so that they turn out not only in a consistent manner of what we're used to, but also in a timely manner. Because one thing that I've noticed when folks bake from a cold starter is that, right out of the fridge, is that it's sluggish, therefore you don't know how long it's going to take to even attempt to double your dough. So make sure you take the time, do things right, I'm going to go ahead and put the link of the video that started this whole wonderful project in regards to how long does it really take for a sourdough starter to be revived from almost 3 months in the fridge. Thanks for watching and happy baking.